Say a couple words of greeting. Well, welcome everyone. I just wanted to say a couple words before we start. I'm Jeremy Drucker, the Executive Director of Transitions. It's very nice to see all of you here, including a lot of familiar faces. This is the second year we've been doing this conference. Last year we did it 25 years after the changes, and we've been constantly trying to come up with topics that are very attuned to current events. And I think this year we probably couldn't have picked a better topic as it turned out. We chose this months before the refugee crisis really hit, but I think given the way the media has been misused over the last couple months, we have a lot to talk about today, on top of the more long-standing problems with authoritarians' control of the media. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Tony Curzon Price, who's the moderator of our first panel, and we look forward to a fascinating couple of days with all of you. Thank you.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to Jeremy and Transitions for inviting me. So I don't know how many of you were at yesterday evening's session. Most of you. It seems to me that session touched on a lot of the issues that we're going to continue with today, or this morning at least. So the theme for this morning's panel is Authoritarianism, Populism, and Media. And I'm going to say very small number of things about that to kick it off. And then I'm going to hand over for a few introductory remarks from our panelists, and then we will turn it into a conversation, and that conversation will partly be amongst those up here, but I hope it'll also be with substantial contributions from you. So, why this topic? Firstly, I think that all those terms and their relationship, authoritarianism, populism, democracy, are difficult and contested terms, even before you layer on top of it how the media feeds into it all. I'm let me say a little bit about where I come from. Actually, I'm not at all an expert on Russia. I'm not an expert on Central and Eastern Europe. I was the editor-in-chief of Open Democracy. I'm now an associate editor there. And my interest in this is looking at Europe and the rise of populisms in Europe. And the rise of populisms, certainly looking at it from the point of view of the UK, we have UKIP on the right, a nationalist populism. And we have a new Labour leader on the left who, to some extent, has been brought up to the fore in what is a sort of something of a people's movement. The Labour Party democratised, and a huge number of people voted for this very left-wing candidate. So, in a very British way, somewhat moderate, we're seeing a polarisation. It's a polarisation that we see throughout Europe. On the left and the right, I'm interested in the differences between what one might call the populists, the Marine Le Pens, the Golden Dawns, and what one might call the popular movements, those who at least call themselves Democrats, that wing of the Labour Party that elected Corbyn, maybe Syriza, maybe Podemos. Is there a difference? Can we tell them apart? Do they have a different relationship to media? And I suppose in the context of this discussion, how do they play with the authoritarian messages, media, and relationship that we're seeing from the East? And so I think this is something that I will be very interested to explore with the panel here, which is what is from the point of view of Putin, what is the usefulness of the populists or the popular movements, and does that entail anything about what our democratic relationship to those movements ought to be? I'm not going to say anything more, I'd like to encourage each of our panelists to at least say just a little bit before they talk on the theme about what their particular interest in the theme and the questions is, just to motivate it. So we'll start off with Chris, who's written about media and democracy and has a sort of very precise analysis of the way in which media is used internally by authoritarian regimes. Chris.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Tony. I thought I would just give a brief overview, trying to flesh out some of the terms that Tony used. As he mentioned, my interest in this comes from the work we do at the National Endowment for Democracy on democratic development issues in all their shapes and sizes. And one of the things we've done in the recent past is an initiative looking at modern authoritarianism across a wide range of topics and areas. So media was one of them. We have a fantastic article written by Peter Pomerantsev, just to promote that, in the October issue of the Journal of Democracy. For those who are interested, also a fantastic article on China's international propaganda written by Anne-Marie Brady, who's one of the foremost minds on that topic. And so we've been looking at how these authoritarian regimes have adapted in the modern context. And I think there is something to be learned from the populist threads that are more visible in the current environment. But let me, by way of introduction, make a couple of points just to provoke some thought. And one is that we've actually undergone what I would call a big shift in the media landscape in the last 20 years. So if we had this kind of discussion 20 years ago, generally speaking, people would have had, I think, a fairly positive view of the way that the media landscape was heading. Not perfect by any means. Clearly there were challenges, but I think generally speaking, at that point, there was a sense in Central Europe, but elsewhere, in the US, broadly speaking, that the opportunities afforded by journalism in these democratic settings or young democratic settings look pretty promising by and large. This was augmented by the sense at the time that the internet would propel this sort of thing, in the sense that it would democratize information, we'd all become more able to access information in ways that weren't quite the same before that. And I think in many ways this is true. Today, if you're motivated and you have the time to devote, you can find just about anything. If you're in, say, the Czech Republic or the US or elsewhere in Europe, for that matter. But I think what people didn't anticipate was the profound impact that this shift would have on what I would call news of civic and political relevance. So today it's extremely difficult for most news organizations, not all, but most, to monetize their online news. For the most part, these are money losers. That may change with time. Innovation may change that. But for the most part, those that are able to do this effectively either have a large business clientele or readership, like the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, or they're using a lot of what I would call non-civic news content generously. So there's a lot of use with news portals in a variety of settings that use sensationalistic, provocative sorts of things, the cats with two heads, as a way to kind of pull people towards news of civic value, if they're so inclined. So I think this was something that really wasn't appreciated at the time. And over time, we've seen this take hold. So what we see now in democratic media settings is that there's a profound inducement for editors and others producing information to use unverified comment, either because it can't be checked, there simply isn't the capacity to do this, or to willingly project it further. And I think in this context, if we look at what the authoritarians are doing, they've exploited this fantastically. And I think part of the explanation is that they have the resources and the will to do this now. And this also wasn't anticipated. So this conversation 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, would have been dramatically different. So as Peter has written very eloquently about, the Russian authorities have figured this out, but it's not just them. This is also true increasingly with the Chinese authorities, who are getting a foothold in media in places as diverse as sub-Saharan Africa to Latin America, and using maybe modified techniques as the ones that the Russian authorities have used, but basically exploiting the space, the globalized space, and they've been very adept, in essence, at turning the tables on our expectations about integration and globalization, and they're using this to their own ends. So that's really a state-driven exercise to exploit the space. I think if we think about the populists, it isn't always a bad thing to be a populist. Populists can ignite reform, but at the same time they can scapegoat, which can be very unhealthy. Populists that operate in democratic environments, for example, Donald Trump is now getting quite a bit of attention. Ben Carson may more or less be in the same kind of sphere as him. They have, interestingly, been extremely skillful in exploiting the new media space. It explains not all, but a good part of the traction they have and their ability to survive the sort of statements and the sort of behavior that absolutely would have ejected candidates in previous election cycles. And part of the explanation is they've absolutely sidelined the elite media and the establishment, and they've gone around them. And a good deal of this is explained by their exploitation of the social media space. Populists also take a kind of suspicious look at the establishment and the elite, which is a defining feature of them. Populism is generally more of a rhetoric or a stance than it is an ideology, so it also adapts this way. And I think what I would say, just by way of concluding, on a number of levels, I think the authoritarians, just to come back to Tony's question, I think in some respects they've cherry-picked or seen the formats, if I could put it that way, of some of the populist threads and trends that we've seen that can be effective for their use. But I would distinguish between the kind of essential character of the populists as compared with the authoritarians in the media context. But maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
That's great. Thank you very much, Chris. So I think the picture you painted was one of economic business model transformations of the last 20 years have weakened a kind of what one might call a liberal media, and that weakness has been exploited both by authoritarians, and I'll be interested to hear more about how and to what effect, but also that same weakness allows populists, and actually in a sense, from the point of view of democracy, I think your point was, at least it's not at all clear that that increased access, the end of the old gatekeepers, is not necessarily in itself a bad thing. I think I'm not sure if that was a fair summary of what you said. It's what I took away. I think it'd be nice now to hear from Yulia, and in particular to hear about her specific experience in a concrete example of producing media and developing a media and editorial strategy in the face of the tactics used by authoritarian media. Yulia. And do introduce yourself better than I would be able to.
Thank you. I'm struggling with where to start here. I guess just as a way of introduction, I have been working in international broadcasting for the last 10 years. I started at the BBC in London, and then I moved to the States, and I work at the Voice of America in Washington now. And when preparing for this panel, I was just trying to figure out where do I place my own work in this framework of authoritarian, popular, and populistic media. I must confess I have a problem with with them, with the whole concept myself. And yesterday at the reception, Tanya and myself tried to figure out what actually is good and what is bad, and do we accept the fact that populism can be good and authoritarian is necessarily bad, and popular is this ideal, almost fictional ideal we need to be struggling to achieve. But when we're talking about the whole concept of authoritarian media being developed in Russia now, after a fair amount of thinking I've done on that, and it might be a very modest conclusion that I came to, you obviously can become authoritarian only by coercion, and you can become populist by choice. And a good example of that is Fox News in the United States. And there you have this example of populist media that is not forced to be populist, but that is choosing every time to please their audience. And to me, the definition of populism becomes is that you know your audience and you know your audience's expectations, and you just try to kind of provide the information that is not clashing with their expectations of reality. So you're just trying to be soothing and pleasing and not confrontational, and that's one of the strategies, and that is fine. Now the question is where we put international broadcasting for Russia in this sense. So I am in charge now of producing, I'm in charge of part of the effort that is officially aimed at countering Russian propaganda. It's a big statement and it's a big mission, and I'm not even sure I understand how you can counter this very well-functioning, well-oiled machine with a lot of resources. I don't necessarily want to talk about resources because it's not an elegant issue, and I'm not going to complain that we function with a lot less resources than Russian propaganda. But basically, I'm just asking myself what do you become when you try to counter this authoritarian message? Because when you're put in a mission to counter something, you become counter-authoritarian, counter-propaganda, and when you actively try to promote something that is opposed to something else, then you get less trust. And I'm a big believer in just, good, old-school, old-fashionable journalism when you present facts and you let people decide for themselves. But apparently, as a lot of people say, as a lot of people concluded, right now it's not working with Russian propaganda. What we do, we produce a show in Russian, and I'm in charge of producing this Week in Review analytical show on Saturdays, and we broadcast, curiously, not in Russia. We broadcast in the Russian near abroad. This term was created in Russia, but for the lack of a better term.
Very imperialist of you to use.
It is, yeah, but we didn't come up with anything else.
I've been told off before.
So you've used it. You've used it as well.
Don't call us the near abroad.
And any other offers for a better term?
Any suggestions for that? I mean, I would be happy to.
The newly liberated states.
That's a good one. NLS, right? NLS. So we broadcast in the Baltics, in Estonia, in the Baltics, in Moldova, in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan. We're expanding in Central Asia, in Georgia, and we are on internet in Russia, but we're not allowed to be on any official TV channels, obviously, because we've been forced out a long time ago, probably like 7 or 8 years ago. And now the question is how we do it, because with authoritarian media in Russia, it's all very clear. I mean, it's all very blunt. You can tell that it is. But for us to be on the same level means putting our integrity making our integrity pretty questionable. So you probably can tell that I'm in this existential crisis right now with how we work and how we place ourselves in this framework and how we stay trusted, trying to counter something that is widely distrusted but that still exists. And I think it's curious with Russian style of authoritarian media, there is so many interesting and curious things happening there. And there are paradoxes of communication patterns when people actually, we were just talking before the panel, and Peter was advocating for not simplifying the whole thing and not thinking that whatever is promoted by the Russian state media is taken for granted in Russia, and I completely agree. And we should remember that just the fact that it is being broadcast on media doesn't mean that it is completely internalized by the Russian public. And there are different communication patterns. And from the Soviet times, people are trained not to believe media. And we should understand that when analyzing the whole situation, because we can say that Russian authoritarian media are successful just because they're being watched by 90% of the population. People may watch, but people might not believe or might not trust that. And my great-grandmother actually used to say they lie like radio. And she was, you know, she was born before Soviet times, and she was living in the Soviet times. So there is this understanding that it's not necessarily the fact that is that you get all the information you need on the state media. And that's why I would argue that for us, for the media that is functioning around, and it's funny that we are now trying to function around the Russian media. We can define ourselves as a self-sufficient medium, but we function around what Russian media is doing, and we're trying to do something about that. So for us, it's important to come up with a strategy, and rather maybe even with philosophy of how things should be done, that we're staying we're being trusted and we're not compromising our integrity. And with a lot of bad things happening in the Russian media and in Russia, we should, I think, be very careful with analyzing communication patterns and maybe be more hopeful in terms of how this future is going to develop, because people indeed do not necessarily trust what we think they do. And I will leave it at that. Maybe it's a little chaotic, but I'm looking forward to your questions, and maybe in the discussion we can, just share more of how we're going to function in this environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Yulia, for that explanation of what it feels like to be doing this. I think one of the things that's really interesting that came out of yesterday evening's discussion, I hope we'll be able to come back to, is the question of trust. In some ways, it seems it seems quite an odd position to be in. On the one hand, to say, the Russian media is not trusted. People don't believe it, and in fact, there's a long tradition of not believing official media, and yet also believing that in some sense there's a great harm that is being done by it, and that harm requires a lot of effort, conferences like this, etc. So I am going to be very interested in exploring and really understanding, as a non-expert, what that harm is. And I guess one can divide the harm into harm to Russia and Russians, harm to the countries in what we can't call the near abroad, and then harm more widely. Is there actually harm in more widely in Europe and the EU? Is there harm globally? So if it's something which that the Russian state does as a matter of almost as a piece of theatre that everyone sees as a piece of theatre. What is the causal chain that leads to it being something that we really must worry about? On which, and possibly with some clarifications, let me hand over to Peter, who will introduce himself if he needs an introduction.
Yeah, hi. My name is Peter Pomerantsev. I'm a fellow at the Legatum Institute, which is a small educational charity and think tank in London, and I run a project about propaganda in the 21st century. We do lovely publications like this. You can look it up online and see our discussions, which are fun. We're looking at propaganda developments across the world. The problem with speaking a third is that everybody else takes away your speaking points. So I'm going to start by trying to answer some of the questions that Tony raised and that Yulia raised. It's a very funny thing, this relationship between harm and lack of belief. There's a lovely study by Northeastern University in the US, which looked at people who were the most likely to distrust mainstream media, MSM, the people who say you can't trust CNN and NBC and it's all a conspiracy. They are actually the most likely ones to then swallow disinformation. They're the most likely ones to fall for fibs. But weirdly enough, it's so paradoxical, people who trust are actually think more critically. People who don't believe anything end up believing conspiracy theories. Russian media plays on this all the time. They've taken the idea of, which was always like an idea of democracy, don't trust, think critically, and they've pushed it to the point where you can't believe anyone. Most of the propaganda is you can't believe the West. The West is just as corrupt as us. Tony Curzon Price is working for the CIA. Chris Walker is working for the NSA. Yulia is working for Mossad. We're working for Mossad. They'll put stories out that the Kremlin is part of a CIA conspiracy. That any Russian opposition member is actually funded by the Kremlin in order to undermine any idea of opposition, leaving you in a world where you can't trust anything, and therefore, as you can't trust anything around yourself, there must be a huge conspiracy. Therefore, the Maidan isn't real, it's actually a conspiracy. Everything's a conspiracy, you can't trust anything. There are enemies out there. Feel the warm embrace of Putin around you in this cold, mean world. So that's the logic. And that's quite interesting to the stuff that I want to talk about more broadly, which is, what they're essentially using is something we associated with the free world, question more, Russia Today's slogan, and pushing it for authoritarian ends. And that's really what we see throughout the world. The line between authoritarian media and democratic media has become blurred, in the sense that authoritarians now use the techniques we always associated with free media, certainly in the Cold War. So I'll go through a couple of examples, just to give you kind of something to play with. A really, really easy one is the internet. We all thought the internet would be this tool for freedom. Very quickly, I think we can all see how authoritarian regimes are using it in sometimes clever ways. I mean, the Russians do very stupid things like troll farms, which is for children. The Chinese are much cleverer. So in this incredible Harvard study, which looked at, 100,000 million Chinese tweets, they found that despite all the stuff we hear about censorship in China, not quite like that. You're allowed to tweet and do Facebook posts criticizing local government. You can say that someone is corrupt, that's fine. They're fine with you articulating your anger. It's quite useful for the central government to know how a certain bureaucrat is doing. They can come up and go, hold on, look at all these posts about you, young man. The minute censorship kicks in, Twitter accounts are closed. Not Twitter, it's the Chinese version, whatever. Social media is closed down, is when they start to self-organize. The minute they get together to have a meeting, it might even be a pro-government meeting. It might be a meeting which has nothing to do with politics. For example, there was a panic in China during Fukushima that nuclear waste was about to arrive on Chinese shores, and there was going to be a big protest. The moment they see self-organization, they shut it all down. So people can't meet. So they are verbally free, but when it comes to self-organizing or physically in chains. That's a very subtle use of the internet. They've used the openness of the internet against democracy. Elections, something we always associated with democracy. Hugo Chavez basically turned his time in power into one long election campaign. There was an election every 6 months at one point. He had sort of leverage over the media, and so all the elections were rigged in his favor. It's hard for other parties to raise money. So by turning it into an election that he would always win, he was constantly in charge. And also he would use a lot of the attributes of Western media. I mean, one of the most popular shows on Venezuelan TV was Allo Presidente, which was basically Jay Leno meets Mussolini. It was a talk show where Chavez would sit. He'd have Sean Penn would come on, Naomi Campbell would come on, he'd sing a song, he'd fire the government, he'd start a war. And this got on for 5, 6, 7 hours on a Sunday afternoon. So he's taking, this is something that we know from democracy, agenda setting, reaching out to the people. He was doing it in a way that sort of Cameron or even Trump can't do, but using it for utterly authoritarian ends. And maybe the last one, and in some ways the most important one, is the use of the free market for authoritarian ends. We always had this idea that we'd have sort of more free market media in these countries, and they would become more free. Quite the opposite. We see how Erdogan uses the media. So media companies that give him a positive or a neutral coverage will then win other contracts in infrastructure and so on and so forth. So sort of the invisible glove. The invisible iron glove of the market is used to stifle freedom and not to promote it. Also, in terms of ideology, the formulas have been reversed. I mean, in the Cold War, you had a very clear sort of brand battle between, on the one hand, you had the West, which had nice cars, the Beatles, parliamentary democracy, and merchant banking. And on the other hand, you had sort of awful Soviet pop music, really bad larders, the Politburo, and the 5-year plan. And it was a very clear kind of cluster. Yeah? What the authoritarians have done, and Russia and China are probably the most sparkling examples, is they've said, you can have merchant banking, you can have MTV, you can have all these things that you attributed with the West, and absolutely no parliamentary democracy. And that's completely broken the package that we used to present, that Radio Free Europe or Voice of America used to present. They've completely broken apart that package. But maybe the most important ideological shift. Do I still have a minute, or have I?
No, you do. There was just a bit of feedback, and I was hoping it wasn't mine.
Oh, it's okay. So I'll make one last point, and then I'll stop, because maybe it's the most important one. Fundamentally, we always thought that the more media we had, the more information sources we had, the better democracy we will have. That was always the idea. If you visit the Museum of Journalism in Washington, right by the Capitol, it sort of goes up the history of journalism, and at the top is the sort of the multiverse, where everyone has their own media, everyone is empowered to speak. And that was always the idea. The more voices you had, the better debate we would have about reality, the better collective decisions we would make. Not so simple, it turns out. So I was recently in East Ukraine during the war a lot, and I was going through these towns, some of them ravaged by war, some of them just full of refugees. And they're bombarded by different realities. They have Russian media telling them one thing, and obviously shutting out Russian channels didn't work, everybody watches it. The Ukrainians tell them another one, local ones tell them a third one, the Americans tell them a fifth one, and their reaction is, we don't believe anyone. And there's been quite a lot of sort of focus groups which bear this out. We don't believe anyone, but in the context of not believing anyone, we will go with the most emotional one, and that's the Russians. They say, we don't believe the Russians. Of course the Russians are lying, but my God, they tell a great story. It's crucified children. Masonic conspiracies, so much more exciting than the tame, rational stuff that Yulia puts out, which I really like, but, it's kind of evidence-based, how boring. So it's funny, in this kind of chaos of too much media, people stop believing anything and will go with the biggest liar, And when we talk about populism, what do we really mean? There's nothing wrong with being popular. I think populism actually, I was thinking when you said, how do we define populism? Aren't we actually talking about a psychological definition of manners? Populists touch on emotional things that we've agreed not to touch in public discourse. The dark sides, yeah? Hatred, all these things that we've agreed not to touch, the Trumps, the Le Pens, etc., go for. They're breaking a social contract about what we can talk about, what we've decided is too dangerous to talk about. And in that sense, look, the last time we had a big rise in populism was also the last time we had a big burst in information technology. Now we have it with the internet, then, start of the 20th century, introduction of radio, introduction of cinema, leads to not greater democracy, leads to the rise of, on the milder side of things, American propaganda that leads to World War I, which is one slew of disinformation, and obviously the rise of totalitarian propaganda, which is populist and plays on these dark forces that we agreed not to talk about. So we're in a very dangerous place, I think. Information bursts, new technology leads to very dark political developments.
Peter, thank you. Let me kick the conversation off by responding with a comment and a question on that. So, at the end of Yulia's talk, I was saying, okay, so distrust, where's the harm? Peter's answer to where's the harm is under confusion, people go for comforting messages, and comforting messages lead to the 1930s. I mean, very roughly, I think is
so not what I said.
Okay. Now, let me pick up on one bit in the caricature of what Peter said, and that is something that came out of the discussion yesterday evening. We all know that producing truth is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. We know that truth itself is a very slippery thing. We know that people get endlessly lost in questions of what truth is, how to define it, etc. So you have a sort of epistemologically sophisticated bit of the population who are extremely aware of all these difficulties. And then you have, at the other extreme, you have an epistemologically naive bit of the population that essentially will come to believe, almost what they come to believe is a matter essentially of accident and can't be changed very much. And then in the middle, you have a group of people, and these are the group of people whom media and mass media might hope to move in one direction or another. You have a group of people who are influenced by the sorts of things that journalists do. And in a sense, what we're talking about is that group in the middle. Now, Peter's view is that group in the middle is prey to conspiracy. I would think that actually it's probably the group that are out on the extreme, whose beliefs are a matter of accident and nothing much is going to change them, who are those who are really prey to conspiracy. But let's take it that those people in the middle are the people who are prey to conspiracy. Can you take it one step further and say, okay, that middle ground, whose minds can be changed by what journalists do, what political consequences, what social consequences are of them holding, of the competition for their beliefs. Occasionally conspiracy, occasionally an intense interest in celebrity or sport. What is at stake in trying to change those minds, not the minds of people in general? I mean, I thought it was telling when you talked about Ukraine. You said, I think, the people come to believe. It seems to me that that's a rather broad category. And can you just talk about what those consequences really are, what that harm is?
Okay, firstly, you're quite right. So all the evidence points to, and Second World War, a lot of research was done about this, people who believe in conspiracies are not thick, quite the opposite. It's people who are very bright trying to connect up all the dots. Ukraine is highly educated, middle-class sort of country, so pretty much everyone there is in the middle. It's not like America where there's sort of some sort of underclass. So it's a sort of fairly, in terms of education and understanding, it's a very middle class, very middling country with much less extremes than someone like America. So I'm not sure. I think stupid people, just people who don't think, don't care. It's actually all the evidence points that conspiracy theories are people who are quite bright, trying to join up the dots in a media chaos. So the absolute kind of opposite. But what's the threat? So listen, I guess the threat is this. And this really has nothing to do with authoritarian and non-authoritarian. This is just a consequence of the media anarchy that we live in. Democracy depends on us having a debate about the facts. So in Britain, it was very simple. We had the BBC, which gave us the facts, and then you had the right-wing press and left-wing press who would debate which was better. But there was a basic agreement on what the facts were. I think the breakdown in politics, or the near breakdown in politics that we're seeing in the US, is very much a condition of people living in their own universes, their own media universes, where they can believe that Obama is a Muslim, vaccines lead to autism, la 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 la, and just with no engagement in the middle. So it's a threat to democracy. Democracy depends on us having a common reality. And actually, I think everybody is a fairly sophisticated epistemological thinker, certainly as sophisticated as I am. I could never pass any philosophy exam, but I do remember learning about Peirce, is that how you pronounce him?
Yeah.
Peirce, Charles Peirce. Philosopher, start of the 20th century, basically comes this, way before the postmodernists, comes to the idea, look, you can't prove anything out there. Beyond you and I sitting there, if somebody calls me and says, it's shining where I am, you can't really prove it, you have to believe him. So epistemologically you can't prove it, but he basically said, and maybe I'm simplifying his arguments because I only read the Cliff's notes, was like, what we need to have as a society, if we don't go mad, is an agreement about not the truth, but how we establish the truth. It can be disproved later on, yeah? But we use evidence, all these sort of old-fashioned things, in order to have a space in which we have some sort of communal discussion. And you keep on coming back to this question about trust. When we talk about the key challenge nowadays isn't getting the truth across. There's too many truths coming in already. The truth becomes just another version. It's about rebuilding trust. And what the modern authoritarians play on, and in that sense they're very different to the 20th century, is not necessarily mobilizing armies, but much more kind of just like causing chaos, suspicion, and in that space sort of maneuvering, whatever tactical gains they need.
Chris, can I bring you in on that? Because you had a view of the good old days, as it were, and the good old days, I think, in your view, were supported actually by a particular economics of media production. You had the big tent that was required by printing presses and that was supported by advertising revenue. And that big tent, in a way, stopped the fragmentation which Peter talks about, in which there is no common arbiter. Is that so? Do we come to the conclusion? Do we come to the conclusion that the technology that we have today of very low-cost media, plus our advanced economies, lead to a situation in which we can't have the particular democratic ideal that Peter describes?
So let me make one quick observation on a topic that hasn't been mentioned, and I'll come to that question, which is, when we've spoken about the authoritarian systems, Russia, China, Venezuela as well, we haven't spoken about censorship. Propaganda flourishes in environments where there's censorship, and one of the things that Hugo Chavez did during his time in power, in addition to ramping up the propaganda, was to embark on a stiff campaign of censorship where he and his cronies took over most of the radio stations that weren't aligned with the authorities there. They absolutely subsumed alternative voices on mass media, on television, and also took over a good number of the newspapers which weren't aligned with the regime. So if you look at Venezuela, the trajectory, if you look at Russia, the trajectory, absolutely. I mean, Russia is more censored today, relatively speaking, than it was 5 years ago, than it was 10 years ago. So this has gotten progressively worse. And by the way, it's gotten worse in China as well, as hard as that is to imagine, in a country that has 640 million internet users, and the growth is increasing. I think one of the things that should trouble all of us, and this comes out loud and clear in Freedom House's very impressive Freedom on the Net report, the most recent edition of which came out about 2 weeks ago, is that you have a host of countries, the ones I just mentioned, as well as virtually all of the countries in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia and virtually all the countries in the Gulf have seen this extraordinary growth in access to the internet. So in those instances, we're talking about 85, 90% in the UAE and these countries. In Russia, it's about 50% and growing. In Iran, it's about 40% and growing. Vietnam, it's about 45% and growing. These countries all have in common that, at least in Freedom House's analysis, which looks at a wide range of kind of political speech enablers, if I put it that way, it's decreasing. So you have this very interesting phenomenon, and I would say troubling phenomenon, whereby these regimes have figured out ways to grow access but shrink political speech. And Peter mentioned the study by Gary King and Jennifer Pan. I mean, it's very illustrative in China, but it's, I think, also relevant to other countries. When the minute you have coordination or organization, this is where the authorities clamp down. So censorship is very important, and I think if we look at the authoritarian cases, we have enormous diversity, but no real pluralism. If we look at France and Le Pen, if we look at Britain and Corbyn, if we look at Trump and Curzon in the US context, there's pluralism in these environments. You may not like the quality of it, the trajectory may be a little dodgy at the moment, but I think it's a fundamental distinction between the authoritarian cases. And finally, let me come to this issue of truth and objective reporting. And I think, Tony, you started to get at this, but I'll just share an observation. I'd be interested for others' reactions. I think we get into a bit of a quagmire talking about how are we going to put the truth into the discussion objectively. And I think it's kind of losing formulation for this kind of discussion. I think one of the ways to look at this is to say, what are the structures and what sort of accountability and transparency should these structures have in providing the news? So it's related, and I'm not optimistic at the moment. In the short term, I'm highly pessimistic. In the mid to long term, I could be more optimistic. But I think right now the media environment has changed so much that it's not a question of romanticizing the old days and the gatekeepers. The question is right now, who's providing the editorial scrutiny? Who's accountable to provide news of civic relevance to mass audiences? And I think this idea that everyone's a journalist, which sounds wonderful on its face, but it raises all sorts of questions about the credibility, the verifiability of information, and unless you have those sort of structures, you're missing something. And so if I compare, so this is the point I was getting to, if you compare RT, CCTV, Press TV, which is Iran's principal international media instrument, and you look at the way they're configured in terms of accountability and transparency and who's ultimately calling the shots there. You can quibble about the precise configuration. In the end, we know who's calling the shots. If you watch CCTV, you won't find a story on Tibet, Tiananmen, Taiwan. You won't find a story in a meaningful way about corruption or politics in China. You simply won't. You may find very good reporting on other subjects with fantastic investment in investigative reports on various sundry subjects, but you won't find a host of things. So this is just off the table. With RT, it's clearer. I mean, you see the Kremlin line one way or another coming through. I think with the BBC, with Deutsche Welle, and such entities, you can quibble with some of the problems they have. You can certainly quibble with the slashing of their budgets, like in U.S. international broadcasting. But in the end, their configuration is fundamentally different. It's a fundamentally different value system. And I think that's what we should be looking at first and foremost, rather than saying, can we generate output that provides the truth? I think we're losing the this idea of accountability and transparency for the delivery of news and information.
Chris, thanks. There's an opportunity to bring in Yulia, and in particular, on what you were saying about censorship, it seems to me, leads quite directly to the sort of thing that you're doing. Because, I think there's a difference here between the view that Peter's putting forward, which is more choice is not good for democracy, and on the other hand, the view which I think the two of you have, which is actually censorship means that the choice is not even there, and if the proper choice were there, then there would be better outcomes. I think that's how you presented your work as the old-fashioned work of the journalist, which is presenting options, which censorship would clearly get in the way of, but which, in a sense, worsens the problem that Peter was pointing at, which is more choice, more confusion. What's your...
I am indeed a big fan of choice because I believe in people who can make their own decisions based on whatever factors they have in mind. When Peter was saying about this array of channels and different journalists and different entities bombarding people with information, I think it's not a matter of choice, it's a matter of consciously trying to create more noise, and I think it's one of the strategies. It's, choice versus noise, pretty much. So you create a lot of noise, and then you become deafened in a sense that you cannot even decide for yourself, and then you completely switch off. And that's another mode of functioning for the consumers of this information. People just don't want to hear anything. They just don't believe anybody, they don't want to hear anything, and they switch off, and that is one of the, I think, goals of the Russian propaganda, to just make people completely disillusioned and to prevent them from being consumers of any kind of information. And to what Chris was saying, yes, indeed, I think that this editorial accountability is important, and it's funny. 10 years ago, I came to NET, to the National Endowment for Democracy, as a fellow, and I was doing my research on citizen journalism, and that was a phenomenon unheard of at that time, and I was just theorizing on the fact how citizens can become journalists and what outcomes we can get out of it. And that was before Twitter, before Facebook. It's scary to think that 10 years ago, it was a completely different universe. So all that research, it was all cheerful, it's wonderful, people can, generate information, and they can feed each other with whatever information they digged out. But then I started realizing, as a news professional, that you indeed need to be a news professional to be spreading the news, and you can do whatever you want to on social media, but then it's a matter of choice, and it's a matter of paradigm. Do we believe in journalism completely vanishing and completely losing its value, or do we believe in this profession, and this mode of functioning staying, and do we let people to just decide for themselves who they trust and what kinds of information sources they use? But I completely agree that it's ambiguous. I believe in choice, but I think that you need to be relying on sources of information that are professional in a sense. So,
can I, before passing it on to Peter, can I just follow up with a question? Because as I understand the VOA's project, it is aimed very much at Russian populations in the Russian periphery. No, that's even worse than the near abroad. Okay, I'll stick to the near abroad.
Stick to near abroad.
I'll stick to the near abroad, exactly. So Russian populations in the near abroad. Now, one of the things that Peter talked about was the way in which an accepted view of the rules and the facts allows a social contract to function. Now, it seems to me that the real... So if we think about harm and we think about what might go wrong, presumably the real thing that could go wrong in the near abroad is a breakdown in the social contract. Indeed, as has happened in Ukraine, but a further breakdown in the Baltic states, in the Caucasus. So if you think about a social contract, as any contract, the social contract itself requires a high degree of trust. Okay, in order to say we are going to have a future together, you have to really trust all parties. Now, we heard again yesterday from Nenad about his experience in Sarajevo, where there's a risk that there's a cleavage, like a cultural, linguistic, or ethnic cleavage, and that social contract might break down. Then I can see real danger ahead. Now the question then, so one could reformulate the question about media intervention as being, well, how can media intervention effectively strengthen the social contract in the places where it needs to be strengthened? And do you think of your project as, your editorial project as being that, and how do you think presenting facts and analysis does that?
Well, for that matter, I don't think that we're responsible for strengthening this social contract in, say, the Baltic states. This is not, it could be our role in that can be questioned. We're a U.S. International broadcasting outlet. What do we have to do with the social contract in Estonia, for example? So that's not exactly how I see the role here of international broadcasting, of any international broadcasting, and my show for that matter. I still think that we're trying to present, because it's in Russian, and this is for the people who actually consume information in Russian, and this is by choice, because you get, they were excluded at some point from the public discourse in a sense, and we're trying to maybe help to get them back in this discourse by providing them alternative information and not let them be fed just by the information they're getting in Russian from Russia, because that's where you get this information from, in Russian, where else? So we're just trying to provide alternatives.
Peter, do you want to defend your view of the relationship between media and democracy as essentially being one, or presumably you would go for the view that media intervention should be about creating that democratic ideal which you think has been lost? And if so, aren't you in the game in a sense of engineering not human souls but social contracts?
Yeah, I am. Listen, I mean, to the previous point you made, look, the old forms of we're talking today about new challenges. The old problems of censorship hasn't gone away. So we're talking about the new phenomena caused by new media and in frontline states, whatever you want to call them. Obviously, the old problems of censorship haven't gone away. We just know that script so well. I don't see what new things we can say about that. No, but picking up on your point about the social contract, let me just give you a couple of examples. I don't have an answer to this. So, in Severodonetsk, which is a city in eastern Ukraine, taken by the separatists, then retaken by the Ukrainian army, the separatists were locals, not very nice people. I mean, it was like, empowered local gangsters and stuff to take over. But they did sort of arrest people for small things. They didn't kill anyone, from what I'm aware. Sadly, when the army came in the volunteer battalions, they did a few summary executions, which really alienated the local population. Not a town with a huge loyalty to Ukraine anyway. I mean, Russian border is 4 miles away. Most people there, their heritage, they were brought in there after the Second World War. Hardly any ethnic Ukrainians. So one young info warrior, he wouldn't even call himself a journalist, when the separatists were looking to take over, tried to build a coalition for Ukraine. This really doesn't have very little to do with media. This is about how do you build a social contract. And he was like, I can't, like in the old days, take up the megaphone and scream, we are all for Ukraine and Khrushchevsky and Bandera. That would not work in Severodonetsk. But he knew the town well, so he went to every person there. He went to the gangsters. He's a former gangster himself. And it's like, do you really want Russian gangsters here? They're going to take over your business. They're like, yeah. You want guns? We've got guns. Then he went to kind of like the drug dealers. Like, do you really want to deal with Russian cops? You know, you've already got the Ukrainian cops in your pocket. They're like, where for Ukraine? Then he went to the businessman. He's like, do you really want Russian rules here? You know, we can get into the EU. You'll have like better terms for your business. They were like, yeah, where for Ukraine? So that's how we built the coalition. This is a year we've been doing this project. And actually everything boils down to one question. In a world of no coherent reality, of multiple messages, where like Donald Trump, you have to change your message for every audience, how do you then stick to a core narrative? Because what he was doing was completely right, tactically. That was the only way to gather a coalition. But how are you going to hold that to form a society? There's a great new paper that we're doing about ISIS. ISIS, unlike the way we think of them, actually changed their message for every audience. To jihadis in the West who are naive, they'll do jihad. For local Sunnis, they don't even talk about religion. They talk about we have better social services. People there don't care about religion. They're surrounded by it. They're sick of it. So they changed their message for everyone. Russia, in its propaganda abroad, one message for the left wing, one message for the right wing. Because there is no coherent core to appeal to, they're just playing all the different audiences. And the question that we face is how do we do, how do we become a bit like them in talking to the gangster in his own language, the businessman in his own language, in order to talk to them, or else they won't care. They're in their little media bubble. They're in their little world. And yet relate that to a core strategic narrative. And that is the single biggest challenge that sort of our counter-propaganda organs face today, I think.
So after this next comment by me and question to Chris, I'm going to hand it over the floor. So get your questions ready for about 3 minutes' time. What I'm interested in what you say, and it links to what Chris said about the populists. So you said about the populists that you said they break taboos. You said that because there are no longer any gatekeepers, they can actually lead to democratic political change. If they break taboos, and in some sense those taboos, I think you're saying, were necessary for the good functioning of democracy, then, what are taboos held by? Taboos are held by authority. They are precisely the things that you cannot question. That's what a taboo is. So is there, I wonder, in your conception of how democracy ought to work, a kind of core Achilles heel of authoritarianism, which is these are the things that we cannot we cannot touch, and if we do touch, it leads to social catastrophe. And there are words that you've used repeatedly. It's quite interesting. You talk about common belief. This is almost, one could almost be having a theological discussion in the 17th century, right? That in a sense, it's okay as long as we all believe that, whatever it is, my theology is no good. So whatever the theological thing is, the step we're not going to take. So maybe bringing it back to the populists. Have the populists, Chris, do you think, have they identified an Achilles heel? Are there taboos which, in a sense, are conception of how society, state, and media operate, need to respect? And in that case, don't we have our own authoritarianism? Is a democratic media possible, Chris?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, the current period we're in may not be a long-term trend. In the United States, everybody's got their eyes on Mr. Trump because he's a fantastic showman. He's got an eye for television. He really has used his reality TV skills to fantastic advantage during this political campaign. But over U.S. history, it's not the case that there have been many populist strongmen that have gotten a foothold. Huey Long, Robert La Follette Sr., that's about it.
Bryant, I would have thought. And then Ted Roosevelt on the back of that.
Ross Perot popped up for a little while. You might put him in that category, but it's not as though they've had staying power, in broad terms. And so I think in this context, we can still at least argue that in the democratic, pluralistic sense, populists will have a role. There's a sense of grievance in the population. Clearly, there's a sense of grievance in the U.S. context, at least with certain segments of the population, right wing of the Republican Party first and foremost. But I'm not sure that this suggests something bigger and deeper necessarily. But just one final thought on the social fabric question. I mean, I think if we don't have quality journalism, I don't think it's a question of more choice. I think it's the quality of the choice that's really essential. So I would welcome more quality choice. I'd put it that way. I think what we're facing now is this fantastic choice, this fantastic diversity, which has become polluted. Peter has alluded to this, by a variety of sources. And in the democratic context, media now either can't properly vet and dispense with that, or they're actually propagating it further because it's interesting and it generates clicks and eyeballs. And that's a big problem. And I think unless there's some self-correction there, it really poses a serious challenge to kind of democratic values in the democracies.
We could, I think the four of us could go on like this for a very long time. So you in the audience will have to stop us by intervening at this point.
I was going to talk about God.
Hi, I'm Sally Brautmitsova from UEA and LSE. I'm having some problem with this idea of the truth. And I guess you expected that question at that point. I mean, as a social scientist, I can accept there are some facts. This many people were killed, ocean temperatures have risen this much, etc. We use as evidence. But the truth, I think, is a little bit harder to capture. And yes, the BBC is a far cry from Russia today, but there is no challenge of the main narrative of the liberal market being the way things should be and quote-unquote democracy, which I think we could question we have in the UK. But I would like for you to interrogate that, particularly in relation to the notion that Tony brought up just now about playing a role in terms of reinforcing social contracts. And perhaps if instead of being so concerned about what is the truth and whose truth is going to win, we might look at that role for the media. And then I have another question about the use of this term authoritarian media.
Should we do just one and then come back to you? Is that...
It's a very quick one. I just want to ask, because I think it plays a role. We used to talk about state-controlled media and pro-government media or party-captured media. In this new environment, is there actually a category of authoritarian media that is independently authoritarian away from the state system in which it operates?
No, I think if anybody used the word truth, it's an accident. Of course, the discussion in any kind of writing that we do or anyone else that's always about evidence-based and fact-based. It's completely taboo to talk about truth in media circles. Maybe philosophers do, but we would never. And if we have today, it is just, improvisatory laziness. Nobody would ever talk about that in any meeting at the BBC or in any meeting where I work in. I don't even think at Radio Free Europe, which is much more aggressive.
Yeah, nobody claims the ownership of truth, definitely. We don't talk about that. That would be pathetic for a journalist to say, well, I know the truth and I'm going to share that with you. And on authoritarian media, you asked, I believe there is no independently authoritarian media because they can only exist in connection with authoritarian regimes because nobody gets authoritarian by choice. I mean, that's not fun. That is just completely compromising you as a professional. But then when there is no choice left, you become authoritarian or you're forced to become authoritarian.
Can I slip in just a very quick point, which is, to some extent, I think one of the things that's I agree with a lot of what you've said, and I think one of the figures that for me is useful in thinking about this is that the truth seeker, and I use the word advisedly, the truth seeker is a heroic figure, and there is this thing about, since the Enlightenment, what the person who goes out, not, the Middle Ages is about people going out slaying dragons. The post-Enlightenment is all about people going out and seeking truth. It's the age of the detective novel. In a sense, James Bond is all about, the world is very clear and you slay dragons. The Bourne Conspiracy is all about finding out what the truth actually is. And the real hero, it seems to me, for journalists, but also the habit of mind, that notion of truth-seeking as a heroic activity, that habit of mind is one which also leads to the sorts of things that Peter's described, which is conspiracy theory, etc., because it is so validating in that great figure of the Enlightenment, the truth seeker. It's so validating to discover something, to uncover, right? And uncovering requires huge amounts of work. It requires resources, requires investigative journalism. It requires a huge amount of expertise and education if you're going to do it in the sciences, for example. And in a way, conspiracy, it seems to me, feeds on the desire to be that extremely Western hero, which is the uncoverer of hidden truth. And it also seems to me, by the way, that figure of the uncoverer of hidden truth is a really useful it's a really useful social belief, social thing to come around, because it makes us critical, although it does open us to some sorts of attacks. On that, there were two questions. Let's take both of them.
Is it work? Yes. Barbara von Freitag. I am a former journalist and now work here for the Prague Civil Society Center. I think this whole debate on social contract is very, very important, because I think it belongs to the reversal of realities that Peter has described. That in a way Russian propaganda in the West is creating this subversion of truth, but has actually created or is about to create and is part of creating something like a real new social contract within Russia. This is, I think, the real force we are facing. The Putin system was running out of a narrative, and instead of stability and growth is now offering precisely this truth of if there is not the Russia I promised you, you will at least have the Russia that you can believe is great, even if deep down you know it isn't, but we make you believe, and this is the daily feed we give you on this. So in a way we are already having a new social contract developing within Russia, and I think the big challenge is when you look at the work that you described that is catering to Russian audiences, as Deutsche Welle is as well, is to cut through that narrative and do the truth seeking that you just described. To debunk this fallacy that is catering to resentment and frustration in the society, it's very difficult to cut through, because people want to believe that this narrative is true. But I think you have to tell the story that about the big palaces being built. By now also Shoigu was in the news. You have to show the patriarch's watches, and you have to go through this narrative that this is a leadership that really is, for once, being good for society. You have to tell the real story that, again, you have a system that is, again, kleptocratic and, again, using society for its own purposes. So it's a different task.
Oh, thank you. Mark Hanna from the United States at University of Southern California and New York University. I want to come back a little bit to the title of the panel on defining populism. Yulia said something I thought that was really incisive, and she defined populism as a sort of form of knowing your audience and appealing to them and confronting them. It's a kind of almost commercial or market logic and implicit in that. And I've been sort of surprised to see throughout my own research a lot of the state television and CCTV and RT have adopted or commandeered a lot of these tactics that forms of assessing public opinion and appealing in a way more nimbly to, as you've been discussing up there, the sort of hopes and fears and desires of their audience, while at the same time maybe the international broadcasters from the United States have become sort of ironically, more of a push media than a pull media, if that makes sense. And so the question I have is, do we... Basically, are we at a point right now where we see more authoritarian regimes using a populist media in countries that we associate as more kind of populist or democratic, ironically, if not using authoritarian media, at least sort of trying to use a strategy of promotion rather than attraction?
So, Yulia, you were going to get back on that. Is the social contract actually being built in Russia through this? I'd like to hear Peter on that as well. And I think the last question, which I'd love to hear from Curzon, it is in a sense raises the question of, well, if Yulia is right that populism is about giving people what they want, maybe they learnt that from the market. And is there something about becoming citizens rather than becoming consumers? And has the market taught us too much to live as consumers to actually have the media that we need?
A lot to address here, but on the social contract, your reading of the social contract in Russia, of the creation of this new social contract, can be, slightly questionable to my mind, because it's not a completely new social contract that is being created, and it's not that they promised stability from the very beginning. Stability had this. It was an unexpected added thing that Russian people got at some point, because there were premises of the greatness of the nation that they have been dwelling on, and stability again just happened. So taking away this economic stability now from the Russian people by not abiding by all this Western ideas, and by living with these sanctions, is just one of the things that I think Russian population is taking so far. It's taken very well. I mean, you go back, there is this saying in Russian that we haven't lived well, so we shouldn't even start doing that. So based on that, I think there is a lot of room for going backwards and not suffering the consequences for the regime. And just briefly on the populism and authoritarian message there, I think that authoritarian media indeed use a lot of populist techniques now, and in Russia it's very obvious and evident. And then I think we need to distinguish RT from propaganda as it happens in Russian, because RT is outward oriented, and people sometimes forget that, saying that RT is part of this Russian propaganda. We should remember that it is in English, in Spanish, etc., and it is propaganda for the places outside of Russia. So this clear distinction should be made there.
Peter, if I understand it, you don't believe that these techniques are actually creating the social a belief in the greatness of Russia and its leadership. You contest that it's effective in building that social contract, even if it's building a different sort of reality.
No, clearly that's a huge part of the narrative. It's like, you're going to be... it's actually quite funny. When you live in Russia, you get kind of... you're actually humiliated every day in little ways. People who don't live there don't understand that this is actually the daily life. You're humiliated when you go out on the street and your car gets cut off by a bureaucrat. You're still humiliated at work, especially if you're a woman, where sexual harassment is just normal. But also if you're an employee, you get screamed at. That doesn't exist. It's still very much a slightly feudal relationship. You get humiliated when you get to the restaurant and some billionaire cuts in before you. You get humiliated every day in a million little ways. You go down the street, the cops try to take something from you. The tax police come, try to take something from you. You get home, you've been humiliated, you feel like a complete and utter snot rag. You put it on the TV, and it says, Obama has been humiliating you every day, and the Kremlin will make you feel great. I mean, what I'm getting to is, apart from the narrative, there's a whole kind of emotional network of things going on underneath which the narrative is really just the kind of the blackhead at the top of. I've been looking a lot at Russian TV recently. I feel quite sick now, but I look at these these presenters that they have. And this is partly a market thing. Russian TV couldn't afford making drama, so they started to do current affairs shows, which are basically hate shows. They really are something out of Orwell. It's people foaming at the mouth, really disgusting, devilish kind of demeanor to the presenters. Both Kisilyov and Solovyov are playing a Russian idea of the devil very, very consciously. Really playing in the way they dress, the way they talk, really straight out of Russian cultural idea of how, demons behave, and doing it very, very consciously. And I was like, what's the charm? This is not a positive image. These aren't like, they used to have Parfenov on Russian TV, which was smart, debonair, globalized, that kind of presenter. Suddenly, and I was like, what's the attraction? Because their ratings are high. And I think there's an emotional contract going on. Basically, the Russian state is saying, that bit of yourself that you always controlled, hate, bitterness, vileness, that's now normal. That is now a behavior. And that is a huge emotional thing, because most of our lives, we spend our lives going, don't show your anger, don't show your violence, don't beat your wife, don't kick your children. Suddenly the state is going, you can kick your children, kick the neighbor, spit at your wife, that's fine, that's what we are, just vote for us. And I think there's a huge emotional bribe going on, and God, is it seductive.
So maybe to offer comments on Mark Hanna's questions, I think the Chinese media model is one that doesn't get enough scrutiny. Russia tends to get quite a bit of attention for a variety of reasons, but what China has done over time is to essentially privatize its media. So internet service providers are required by the authorities to have departments that are large and competent enough to do the censoring for the authorities. It augments what the various ministries do. The entire media infrastructure, journalists, editors in China, are compelled by the market in the sense that they have to produce politically anodyne or politically aligned content to one degree or another that's also commercially successful. And if they don't meet one or both of those criteria, they don't get promotions, they don't get professional advancement. Of course, if they challenge the political criteria, they can face much worse consequences, and that happens on a routine basis there. So you have this kind of hybrid media system that's rather durable. And internally, it's been successful in controlling major narratives. Externally, I think this is also understudied. And there's some terrific reporting by my former colleague, Sarah Cook, who's done a wonderful report on how China's international media both operates beyond its borders and tailors its content to various audiences, also with a commercial sensibility. It's rather effective. So now a fantastic portion of the Chinese diaspora remains within the CCP information space. It's a rather remarkable achievement. So that's one part. Coming to your question about whether U.S. international broadcasting, and I guess by extension, the major international broadcasters in Europe are pushing and taking on authoritarian features. I'm not convinced. And I think part of what's happened over time is that they've fallen into the challenge that all media have fallen into, which is there's this enormous choice now. There's enormous diversity, and VOA and RFERL and the BBC have to compete with a much larger number of outlets. I think one thing that's important, we haven't talked much about middle-performing countries. We've talked about the advanced democracies, we've talked about the authoritarians. Very difficult, as Yulia mentioned, for these international broadcasters simply to get access in a place like Russia because they've been cleansed from the FM dial. They don't get access to the media market there. This is something that also isn't appreciated. But if we look at a region like the Balkans, it's southeastern Europe, today for RFERL's Balkan service, for the BBC and others, their main competition are Gulf state media, Iran, Russia increasingly, China Radio International is very active. And so there's a competition that's emerged with both the scaling back of what I would call more, U.S. international broadcasting is much more in the public service tradition in the sense that they're not commercial. They're competing against commercial media. They often have these fantastically difficult internal challenges of figuring out how to be popularly successful while remaining their credibility and the quality of their content in this new media environment. And I don't think they should stray from that, frankly. I mean, I think that's the added value they have. If they were to simply become another garden variety commercial outlet, what's the point, in the end? So I think it's less that they're becoming more authoritarian than it is they're simply trying to find their way in this new space.
Unfortunately, I think we've come to the end of our allotted time, and we need to keep some time for some coffee. I'm sure that all the burning questions that are out there will be discussed very much over the coming couple of days. It's been a huge pleasure. It's been absolutely fantastic and fascinating. Thank you very much, and thank you, the audience.
Thank you.